The 12th of September, 1944, Le Havre, on the northern coast of France. A German colonel named Hermann Eberhard Wildermuth had a direct order from Adolf Hitler: hold the port to the last man. He had concrete bunkers. He had heavy guns dug into the cliffs. He had more than 11,000 men. 3 days later, he handed all of it over. More than 11,000 German soldiers walked out of their fortifications with their hands in the air. They did not surrender to a flood of infantry. They did not surrender to a wall of artillery. Many of them gave up at the sight of a single ugly machine, a boxy British tank dragging a small armoured trailer behind it like a wagon. It looked ridiculous. It looked like something cobbled together in a farm shed. German gunners who saw it coming had one word for it: cruel. And then they put down their rifles. This is the story of the Churchill Crocodile, the flame tank that won battles before it even pulled the trigger. To understand why grown soldiers feared it that much, you have to understand the problem it was built to solve. By 1944, the Allies were not worried about open battles in the field. They were worried about concrete. The Germans had spent years pouring it. The whole northern coast of Europe was wrapped in a belt of fortifications they called the Atlantic Wall. Bunkers along the beaches, gun casemates in the cliffs, strongpoints stitched through every port town, forts with walls measured in feet, not inches. A normal tank could roll right up to one of these bunkers and fire its main gun at point-blank range, and the shell would smack into the concrete and do almost nothing. The wall was just too thick. The defenders inside would feel the bang, shake off the dust, and keep shooting through their narrow slits. So how do you kill a thing you cannot crack open? You could send in men. You could ask infantry to crawl across open ground, right up to the firing slit, and shove a satchel charge inside. That meant a soldier carrying a sack of explosives on foot into the one place every German gun was already pointed. Some of them would make it. Most of them would be cut down halfway there. And even the ones who reached the wall had to stand beside it, light the charge, and hope. The cost in young lives was brutal, and everyone planning the invasion knew it. The Germans knew it too. That was the whole point of the concrete. It turned every strong point into a meat grinder that ate attackers and barely noticed. Britain needed an answer, something that did not have to punch through the wall at all. The answer started with a tank almost nobody loved. The Churchill was a British infantry tank, heavily armoured and slow, painfully slow. It crawled across the battlefield at little more than walking pace. Crews joked about it. Other armies had faster, sleeker machines. The Churchill just plodded forward, soaking up hits, taking its time. But that thick armour and that patient pace were about to matter more than speed ever could. The idea came from a part of the British war effort with an almost comic name, the Petroleum Warfare Department. Their job was to find ways to turn fuel into a weapon. They had been tinkering with flame for years. In July of 1942, the Army actually ordered 12 pilot models of a Churchill flame tank. Then, just 1 month later, the War Office cancelled the whole thing. The reasoning was that tanks were too precious and too vulnerable to send right up to the enemy, where a flame weapon would have to work. It looked like the idea was dead, but the Petroleum Warfare Department refused to let it go. Quietly, they kept working. They improved the trailer. They improved the fuel, thickening it so it flew further and clung harder. They kept the design alive with no one important paying attention. Then, in 1943, a demonstration changed everything. A senior officer named Major General Percy Hobart watched what flame could do to a fortified position. Hobart ran a strange and brilliant outfit, the 79th Armoured Division. His men built tanks that did jobs no normal tank could do, tanks that swam ashore under their own power, tanks that beat paths through minefields with spinning chains, tanks that carried bridges and dropped them across ditches. The whole collection earned a nickname: Hobart's Funnies. Hobart looked at the flame tank and saw the answer to the concrete problem. He pushed hard to get it built. In October of 1943, the Churchill Mark VII was chosen to carry it, and the work was timed to be ready for the invasion of France. And here is the clever part. They did not build a new tank from scratch, they built a kit. A Crocodile was a normal Churchill that had been converted. A flame projector replaced the machine gun in the front of the hull. An armoured pipe ran along the underside of the tank, carrying fuel forward from behind. And behind the tank, on a simple two-wheel trailer, sat the fuel itself. That is the part that made it look like a joke, a war machine towing a little wagon. But that little wagon was the whole secret. The trailer was armoured. It held 400 imperial gallons of thickened petrol, Not thin runny fuel, but a sticky gel that clung to whatever it touched and kept burning. The whole thing weighed around 6.5 tons. Inside it sat 5 cylinders of compressed nitrogen, and that gas was what pushed the fuel out, forcing it forward through the pipe and out of the projector in a roaring jet. The crew could fire roughly 80 bursts of flame, each about a second long. The design had a hard requirement built into it. It had to be able to throw flame for at least a full minute without stopping. That does not sound like much until you remember what 1 second of flame does to a man in a concrete box. And there was one more detail that mattered enormously. If the trailer was hit, or if the crew needed to move fast and fight as a normal tank, they could drop it. The trailer was built to be jettisoned from inside. Cut it loose, and the Crocodile was just a Churchill again, with its 75mm turret gun still ready. Because here is something most people get wrong. The Crocodile did not give up its real weapons to carry flame. The turret gun stayed. The flame projector simply took the place of the front machine gun. It still fought like a proper tank. It just had one extra and terrible trick. Now, the range. This is where the Crocodile beat everything that came before it. A man carrying a flamethrower on his back could reach maybe 40 yards. To use it, he had to walk almost into the mouth of the enemy bunker, with the defenders firing at him the entire way. It was close to suicide. The Crocodile could reach far further, around 80 yards in practice, and on a good day stretching well beyond that. The exact number is argued over to this day, and the truth is it depended on the wind, the fuel, and the ground. But the meaning is not argued over at all. It could burn a bunker from outside the range of the weapons defending that bunker. Sit with that for a second. The German gunners could see the flame coming. They could not reach the thing throwing it. They were inside a sealed concrete room, and a wall of fire was crawling toward their firing slit, and there was nothing they could do to stop it. Around 800 of these conversion kits were eventually made. 250 of them were set aside for the war against Japan, held in reserve for an invasion that, in the end, never had to happen. But it was in Europe, against German concrete, that the Crocodile earned its name. The first flame action came on the 7th of June, 1944, the day after D-Day. Crews from the 141st Regiment of the Royal Armoured Corps, an old unit known as the Buffs, took their Crocodiles into action inland from the beaches. The reports from that first fight already carried the pattern that would define the whole campaign. Germans coming out, hands up, a white flag going up after the tanks appeared before much fire was even thrown. But the moment that truly proved, the weapon came back at Le Havre. When Colonel Wildermuth took command of that fortress, he had Hitler's order to die in place. He told his own men something quietly different. If enemy tanks came, and they had no anti-tank guns left to stop them, they were allowed to surrender. He was a soldier, not a fanatic, and he had already decided not to throw his men into the fire for a port that was going to fall anyway. The assault began on the 10th of September. It was a huge set piece. Infantry, artillery, bombers overhead, and the funnies leading the way through the minefields and the ditches. On the second day, Crocodiles moved against the outer strongpoints. Faced with flame tanks, they had no way to stop. The last outer defences gave in at 2 in the afternoon. The next day, the garrison commander made it official, surrendering just before noon on the 12th. More than 11,000 Germans became prisoners. A fortress meant to hold for weeks had folded in 3 days. The weapon was barely getting started. A few hundred miles away, at the port of Brest, sat one of the toughest nuts of the entire campaign, Fort Montbarey, an old 18th century French fort 2 miles outside the city with walls roughly 40 feet thick, a moat about 15 feet deep, anti-tank ditches, minefields, heavy guns, and around 250 defenders who had no intention of leaving. It was the kind of place that should have cost hundreds of lives to take. In the middle of September, 15 Crocodiles were sent against it, along with a handful of support tanks. Among the crews was a young trooper named Alan Lynn from West Hartlepool in the north of England. He had enlisted just before Christmas of 1942 at 18 years old. The tanks crawled forward, hunting for a gap in the defences, taking fire the whole way. The Germans inside held on stubbornly. For days the fort would not break. Then the Crocodiles closed in and flamed the structure. The defence collapsed. The fort fell, and well over 100 prisoners were marched out of a place that had been built to be unbreakable. There was even a moment earlier, in June, near a village called La Sonaudière, where a single Crocodile flamed a German Panther tank and stopped it dead. A flame weapon, built to burn out bunkers, killing one of the most feared tanks Germany fielded. And later that autumn, British crocodiles even rolled out alongside the Americans, helping them at Brest and at Geilenkirchen, lending the same terrible trick to a different army. So how do you measure a weapon like this? Not by how many men it killed, by how many it convinced to quit. There was a wartime study, plainly titled An Analysis of the Operational Use of Churchill Crocodile Flamethrowers in Northwest Europe, covering June to October of 1944. It looked at 31 separate actions, and the numbers it found are the most important part of this entire story. In those 31 actions, the flame killed 154 enemy soldiers. In those same 31 actions, it caused 5,425 of them to surrender. Read those two numbers again. For every one man killed by fire, more than 35 chose to give up rather than face it. The report itself concluded that the real value of the crocodile was its effect on enemy morale. The flame often caused resistance to collapse early, and by doing that, it saved enormous numbers of Allied lives because every position that quit was a position nobody had to storm on foot. This is the strange truth at the heart of the crocodile. The thing that made it so effective was not the killing, it was the fear. Soldiers who would stand and die against bullets would not stand against fire. So many of them surrendered again and again that the tank often broke a position before it had to truly use itself. At the sight of it, on its appearance, after the first ranging shots licked across the ground in front of them, that is what it means to win before you fire. Not that the weapon never fired, it fired plenty, but its reputation arrived before it did, and that reputation did half the work. Now we have to be honest about the other side of this. Flame is a horror weapon. There is no gentle way to say what it does to a human being trapped in a concrete room. The men who served on these tanks knew it. The only commander to write a full memoir of the experience was an officer named Andrew Wilson, who joined the Buffs in Normandy just after D-Day as a 20-year-old lieutenant in charge of 3 of these tanks. He described the strange weight of carrying that kind of power. He wrote about himself in the third person, almost as if holding the memory at arm's length. He did not celebrate it. And the crews carried a private fear of their own. There were reports that German soldiers, enraged by what Flame did, would not take crocodile crews prisoner. The men feared that if their tank was knocked out and they were captured, they might simply be shot rather than held. How widespread that really was is hard to say, and it sits closer to rumor than to proven fact. But the men believed it. And every time they towed that trailer into battle, they were towing 6.5 tons of fuel right behind their own seats. A single round in the wrong place, and the weapon could kill its own crew. So picture the whole thing, a slow, ugly tank dragging a wagon of fire that could kill the men inside it just as easily as the enemy. Crews who feared a bullet behind the lines as much as one in front, a weapon nobody wanted to think about too hard. And yet it saved lives by the thousand, because every German who raised his hands at the sight of it was an Allied soldier who did not have to charge that bunker on foot. There is one last image, and it is a grim one. In 1945, after the camp at Bergen-Belsen was liberated, the huts there were found to be riddled with typhus. To stop the disease from spreading, the buildings were burned to the ground. Flame carriers and Churchill crocodiles were among the machines that did it. The same weapon that had terrified the German army ended the war, doing the quiet, awful work of cleaning up the horror that army left behind. When the fighting stopped, the crocodile faded fast. It was a tool for a very particular job, in a very particular war. The kits were stored, scrapped, forgotten. Today, only a handful survive, sitting silent in museums, the little trailer still hitched behind. Most people who walk past one have no idea what they are looking at. They see a slow old tank with a strange wagon, and they move on. But somewhere in France, 80 years ago, 11,000 men once looked at that exact silhouette coming over a rise. And they decided that whatever was waiting for them back home was better than what was waiting for them inside that bunker. They were right to be afraid. And the men who crewed it were braver and more burdened than we ever really stopped to remember.